Now that we have set up the model for profit with number of catalogs to be mailed as the decision variable, then response rate, or how many of those 100,000 will respond, that is an uncontrolled or independent variable. And we want to do some sensitivity analysis. Now, first question is, what is the sensitivity of profit to the response rate? And we want to use what is called data table to generate this. And the data table command is under data what if data table. But before we apply the data table command, we have to set up the input values for the different response rates. Now we want to use 1% through 10% as the possible response rates for this independent variable. So we can set up 1 to 10% by typing 1% and 2% and then making a plus and dragging, and that will generate the rest of the values for us. Now notice that I have left the top row blank. Now here is where we have to set up the output from the data table. Okay, for these different response rates, what is the output that we are looking for, which is profit. So you need to enter the cell address of that output, which is that E13, which we have already named as profit in the previous video. Okay, now we are ready to apply the data table command. So having set the input and the output out, now you have to highlight these two columns. Now we can have additional output if you like, in which case you will highlight all the output columns with the first column being the different input values. Then you go to data, what if analysis, and data table. Now we have two different input cells, row input cell and column input cell. Now this particular table has only one input, which is the response rate. So if you have two different inputs, then you'll use both these input cells. But since this data table has only one set of input values, we have to use only one of these two. And you look at how the input values are set up. Input values here for the response rate are set up as a column. Okay. So this needs to be a column input. If you had it this way, okay, then it would be a row input cell. But here the inputs are organized as a column, so it is a column input cell, and these different response rates must go into that cell for the model to recalculate new profit for those different response rates. So that is where the input values should be entered. Now if you click OK, the different profits are listed for different response rates. We can prepare a graph for different response rates as x-axis and the profit on the y-axis. Now if you set it up in this fashion, then you can highlight the x-axis and the y-axis. We'll use this one. So the points are connected. Since there is only one y-axis value, we don't really need a legend, so we'll get rid of the legend. Now let's format this graph by including chart title, which is profit versus response rate, and y-axis title is profit, and x-axis title is response rate. Now we can include $sign for these numbers. So click on these values to make a box, right click, format, number, currency, let's put no decimal places there. So that gives us the graph. The next question is at what response rate we will break even. So in other words, at what response rate will the profit be equal to 0? So here we can see that there are negative profits, that is, we are making a loss all the way up to here, and there is a transition point where we start making profit. And what is that exact point? So let's set up the profit right here. We can use the command called goal seek. See right there. You can use goal seek to find the exact point at which profit will be 0. In other words, a break-even point. So click goal seek. Now here there are three things that you have to set up. Now we want that cell, the profit cell, okay, so that is your set cell. And that value you want to set is to 0. Okay. For this to happen, you must have a formula here. If you don't have a formula, then nothing will change. So Excel will give you an error. So we have profit, and that should be 0. And you want to do that by changing the response rate. So response rate is your by changing cell. When you click OK, Excel figures out at what value for that cell you'll get a 0 for profit. So that is your break-even response rate. So this is probably not 6% exactly. So if you want to increase the decimal places, then you will see at what precise response rate you will have a break-even point. Now in this example, we looked at only the independent variable, the response rate, which is not in our control. So we want to just look at what response rate we will have profit, what profit, and so on. Now we can also do a what-if analysis with respect to the number of catalogs mailed for a given response rate. Or you can do a two-dimensional table between the number of catalogs mailed and the response rate and have even a broader kind of what-if analysis. Okay, now let's look at one more command. Now let's look at what are called trace precedence and trace dependence. And this is useful when you have an error in the model and you want to figure out what's going on and where the error is and how to fix it. So you click on any given cell, then trace precedence will give you the cell addresses that you have used to set up a given cell. So for example, if you go here to profit and then you say trace precedence, then it will tell you what cells are brought in as input into this cell. So that is trace precedence. Let's remove the arrows. Now trace dependence would be in which cells a given cell is used as input. So let's take this cell and then say trace dependence, and it gives you in which cells this is used as inputs. So trace precedence, trace dependence. And these are very useful for debugging. If there is a bug in the program, if there is an error or something, then how to find where the errors are and how to fix it.